So we'll get started. And I'd like to extend to all of you who have come today a very warm welcome on a very wintry day. And we had no idea yesterday if we were going to have this event, but in fact it's wonderful to see all of you here tonight and or this afternoon. And that there have been two organizations here at the Pardee School that have made this possible. The Center for the Study of Asia, the VU Center for the Study of Asia, and also the International History Institute. And so I'm going to introduce our speakers with just a little bit of detail because we've got 2 hours, and I think this is just a very distinguished group, all great experts on Japan, but from very different perspectives. So that's going to be part of our treat here today, is that we're going to be able to hear some of these different perspectives. And first, let me just welcome back to Boston University Consul General Takahashi from the consulate here in Boston and for all New England. And I appreciate very much your opening our conference last April on the Russo-Japanese War, and to have you back is wonderful. He's a fellow graduate of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, as I am. And I'd like to thank you especially for your long and distinguished service to the practice of diplomacy on behalf of your home country, Japan. Following training at Tokyo University of Foreign Affairs and Fletcher School, Consul General Takahashi entered the Foreign Ministry in 1993, I think, right? So he's served in many positions, many distinguished positions. Early on, he worked in analysis, policy planning, international press divisions, and then worked as counselor in the embassy in Rome. And later, you were counselor to the Cabinet Secretariat, which acts as the key conduit between the Prime Minister and the bureaucracy. So very central to both national governance as well as foreign affairs and foreign relations. You've worked heavily with OECD, you've worked heavily with Central Asia, and so very broad global experience. And in 2021, he was appointed Minister to the Embassy of Japan in Israel. And he was in the embassy on the day that Hamas changed the world by attacking a music festival in Gaza, killing 1,200 and abducting 251 hostages on October 7th of 2023. So after guiding Japan through that crisis on location, he was appointed 8 months later as Consul General here in Boston. So you've had a wide-ranging, really a brilliant career in diplomacy representing Japan, and we're very privileged to have you with us today. So thank you very much for being here. Professor William Grimes, welcome, and thank you for coming to make discussant remarks about this presentation this evening, which, by the way, as you know, is the diplomacy of gift exchange during the 1853-54 Perry expedition to Japan. As a younger person, at age 13, you moved to Japan, and you've lived there for several years, 8 years, 10 years, and engaged in Japanese studies at Yale and Princeton. And when I first met you, it was in 2010, it was at a breakfast. The VU alum had dragged me along to a breakfast. And so Bill Grimes and Joe Fewsmith, the great expert of Chinese elite politics, were there. And so we had a very nice chat during that breakfast. And you had just founded the Center for the Study of Asia, and Joe was just becoming the director. And so they conspired to invite me to come and to do some research here. So that was a great opening for me. And of course, Joe passed away recently. This is a great loss to all of us in the Asia Studies community. And I know that he was somebody who, because I was a little bit more China-focused than Japan-focused at that time, but he was really essential to my work at that time. So Bill, you said to me, it's all about the conversations. So here we are tonight having one of these conversations that we're all going to share in, and is going to expand our horizons. And that's the great advantage of being in the academy, and we need to all learn together. So thank you very much for bringing this perspective. Now, our main speaker tonight is Dr. Matthew C. Perry. Welcome very much to Boston University. And we're happy to have you with us this afternoon. As a fourth-generation descendant of the family of Commodore Matthew C. Perry, you're the current generation who is the family historian. So you've brought together really a lifetime from the time you were in grade school in Bristol, Rhode Island, and your teacher asked you to stand up and talk a little bit about your ancestor, the great Commodore Perry, that you became interested in that subject and you spent much of your life. At the same time, you've had 2 day jobs over the course of your life, and one of them was in the U.S. Navy, that as a younger man, he was an officer on a ship in the Western Pacific during the Vietnam era. You had 2 R&R, rest and recreation visits to Japan that kindled that spark that already you knew about in your family, but you were able to spend time there at that time. But when you came back, you decided that you really loved biology, wildlife, the outdoors, and being a wildlife scientist. And so for many years, 40 years, you worked as a research scientist at the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. I took a look at your list of publications. There were about 12 per page. I reached page 12. And so you've been very prolific, but I was especially interested by the first one that you did in January of 1973, what was called Wood Duck Observed Following Geese. Okay, so Bill Grimes is probably especially interested in this article, since Bill recently wrote a chapter for our book on China's Belt and Road Initiative that was titled Flying Geese 2.0, Japan's Strategy as a Prelude to the BRI. So, Matt, you were surprisingly prescient about the important role of geese as leaders. The metaphor that Japan used for leading economic development, especially in Southeast Asia during the 1980s. So I'll point out that this Japan lead goose economic development theory followed publication of your article, Matt. Okay, and the wood duck, about the wood duck following the geese. So it's amazing to me that wildlife science and political economy are coming together in such an unexpected way today. So without further ado, let me invite Consul General Takahashi to start us off, and then Dr. Perry will give the main presentation, and Professor Grimes will follow. So let's get started. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rhode, and of course, Perry Sensei, and Grimes Sensei, and other faculty members of this distinguished center for the study of Asia of Boston University. And ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you once again, for having us here today. Obviously, I'd like to start with expressing my sincere appreciation to the Boston University, and especially Dr. Rhode for their continued support and initiative in organizing a series of events, something like this, exploring the history of our country, Japan. Last year, on the occasion, as he mentioned his remarks of the 120th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Portsmouth, which ended Russo-Japanese War 1904-1905. Boston University hosted the event 120-year retrospective, so Russo-Japanese War and the Treaty of Portsmouth with implication for today, initiated by, once again, Dr. Rhode. Professor Chiharu Inaba of Meiji University, very renowned expert on the Russo-Japanese War from Nagoya City, Japan, participated in the conference. Experts gathered to engage in lively discussion about the treaty, which holds not only historical but also contemporary significance and meaning for Japan and the United States. I would like to express my renewed gratitude for Dr. Rhode's initiative. Since my arrival in Boston in September 2024, Dr. Perry has enlightened me on numerous previously, at least to me, unknown aspects of Commodore Perry's history. Today's theme concerns the gifts of his choice. one of the most important aspects of the art of the diplomacy. Though these are not necessarily the traditional Japanese crafts or sweets or sake, which I typically or usually present to American politicians and other friends here in New England. 30 years ago, as again, mentioned, by Rhode Sensei, I was actually at Fletcher School, at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I did, I did take a course, under the late Professor Richard Pipes at the Harvard University, and I did make a little of this, study and survey on the history of the the Russia's negotiation for the opening of Japan. In 1853, just 1 month after Commodore Perry's mission arrived in Japan, a delegation led by Russian Admiral Puchachin also arrived there. Both conducted negotiations for Japan's opening to the outside world almost simultaneously. While the Puchachin's mission entered, his fleet, entered Nagasaki, the only port where foreigners were permitted access under the Tokugawa shogunate's isolation policy. Then, the Commodore Perry's mission abruptly entered the territorial water in the capital region of Edo. While the United States negotiating stance, imposing, for example, designated negotiation locations and then deadline and so on, might have been perceived, intimidating, by the Edo shogunate officials. While the relationship between Admiral Puchachin and Kawaji Toshiakira, the Japanese plenipotentiary for this negotiation, is said to be one of mutual respect. In Japan, the term flagship refers to Commodore Perry's American fleet, but usually never applied to Admiral Puchachin's Russian fleet. And then on October 1853, the Crimean War broke out. And Admiral Puchachin fleet had no choice but leave Nagasaki and fled to Shanghai, among other actions, causing negotiations to be suspended. When the Commodore Perry then, his delegation returned to Japan in February next year, 1854, they brought this gift in question. And yes, Dr. Perry's perspective is always intriguing and inspiring to me, and drawing my attention to these cutting-edge science and technologies, including electrical telecommunication system and steam locomotives brought and demonstrated by the American delegations to the shogunate's top officials, that could have the most profound impact on the Japanese side to move the negotiation ahead. One of the former U.S. ambassadors to China has stated that the technological superiority will ultimately decide the strategic competition between the U.S. and China. The key words for our new administration under Takaichi-san, the first lady national leader for the history of Japan, the fundamental enhancement of national defense, national security capabilities, and the revival of the technology-driven nation. What will shape international relations? Hard power, soft power, mixture. Anyway, Dr. Perry's talk today is surely offering an endless stream of intellectually stimulating and insightful points, maybe to answer these questions. And I do look forward to another opening visions from him in the course of today's lecture. Thank you very much.
Yeah, please, Matt.
This is indeed a pleasure to be here with such a nice group on a snowy, dreary day. I thank Grant for setting this up, and it's an honor to have the Consul General here. Greatly appreciate your presence. What I want to do today is talk about the role of gifting in regards to Perry's success in diplomacy. Now, first I want to talk about a little of the family connection, which I grew up with, and I think it's an important connection with his success. And then I also want to end up talking about the continuation of gifting in regards to friendship and keeping our close relationship with Japan. I've been involved with a cultural exchange for the last 15 years. I go to Japan every year and give lectures over there, but the whole emphasis is maintaining the friendship that the United States has had with Japan for so many years. That's so important in our two-country heritage. I'll talk more about this picture later, but I want to start talking about the family connection. This is Commodore Perry's father, Captain Christopher Raymond Perry. He started out in the Revolutionary War in the Army, in the militia of Rhode Island. But he got in a little trouble there because he killed a man, and he killed a Quaker. He descended from Quakers, but he left the Quaker heritage and became a revolutionary, and then killed a Quaker, which made him cross Narragansett Bay and end up in Newport, where his son Matthew was born. One of his sons were born in South Kingston, but he changed over to Newport, and he lived there in Newport. But before he did that, he traveled. He was taken a prisoner twice during the Revolutionary War, and while he was in Ireland, and one of the notorious prisons there, as an officer, he was allowed to go on leave, and he met Sarah Wallace Alexander at that time. She was a descendant of William Wallace. Some of you who might remember the old movie Braveheart, you know about William Wallace, you know about his fiery spirit and how he was eventually captured by the British, tortured, and executed. Well, that made the Wallaces leave Scotland and end up in Ireland, where Christopher met her. They traveled back to the United States on the same ship. She was 16 years old. He was 22 years old. They fell in love on the ship. When they arrived in Philadelphia, they wanted to be together. They were going to send her back to Ireland because the people she was going to stay with had died from some epidemic that was going on at that time. But Christopher said, no, she can't go back, got to stay here, I'm going to marry her. They were married that night and then left from Philadelphia, came up to Rhode Island. They had 8 children. The first one was Oliver Hazard Perry, and I'm going to talk briefly about him. The second was Raymond Henry Jones Perry, that I'm descended from, and then the 4th child was Matthew, Commodore Perry's name. His middle name was Calbreth, which is sort of unique because the man that was bringing Sarah to the United States, his last name was Calbreth. His son's name was Matthew. And so when they had children, they named their 4th child for the son of the person that was bringing Sarah to the United States. I want to talk just briefly about Oliver Hazard Perry because he had such an influence on Matthew and probably had a lot to do with his success. He was the hero of the Battle of Lake Erie. Unfortunately, he got into a little dispute in Lake Erie because one of the other officers thought that he should have gotten more credit. And Perry had this long relationship going on with Elliott, Captain Elliott. And that caused them to send him to Venezuela, of all places. And he went down there and unfortunately got bitten by a mosquito and died of yellow fever. So he had a very short life. Died at the age of 34. But during that time, He was very well known in the United States as being a hero by beating the British at Lake Erie. And it was at that, excuse me, at that time, he had this transfer his ship transfer his command from the Lawrence to the Niagara, which became this famous painting, which doesn't have too much truth to it because of the fact it was a very calm day and there wasn't any wind, and there was only 4 people that rowed him to the other ship. But this is a famous painting that's down at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. The original was in Columbus, Ohio. But this is his transfer. Here's another image of the transfer with only 4 people. They didn't take the American flag because he didn't drop the colors. The ship was still, hadn't surrendered yet, but he did take his battle flag, which was "Don't give up the ship," which was sort of ironic because he was giving up the ship to go to the Niagara, where he eventually beat the British. And this famous expression, "We have met the enemy and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner and a sloop." He sent this to Harrison, who was his superior in the army. And this was the first time the British had ever lost a complete fleet. So here's Matthew Perry to bring us up to the subject matter, the main subject matter. He was a midshipman under his father, so Christopher had a big influence on him, and a lot of the traits that he had as a commanding officer were attributed to his father and also to his mother. And a lot of times people don't give enough credit to the women, but she was a major influence on his life. And I'll talk more about later on in his life. His mother was his wife was a big influence. He was a lieutenant under his brother, Oliver Hazard Perry, in the War of 1812. And then he became a master commandant, which is now called commander. They changed that title. But it was at that time, in 1935, when he had this portrait done of himself. He must have been pretty cocky. In fact, we'll talk more about how cocky and sure of himself he was, because he wasn't a captain yet. And at that time, captains had 2 epaulets, but a commander only had 1. But the portrait of him here by Mount has 2 epaulets. He married Jane Slidell Perry. The Slidell family was very well known. You probably know about Slidell, Louisiana. John Slidell was a merchant in New York City. Very famous family with an awful lot of money. So Commodore Perry married Jane Slidell in December of 1814, and they had 10 children. It's important, I'm not going to go through all the children here, but the important thing is their own children the own males didn't really amount to the big success that Commodore Matthew Perry had, but the women married well. And at that time, women didn't get a good education. They didn't have the opportunities that men had. And one of the roles was the father or the brothers had to make sure that the women married well. And they married very well. One married a Belmont, who did the New York subway and the Cape Cod Canal, and then also a Tiffany of the Tiffany family, Silver family, and then another married into the John Hone family. So there were some interesting marriages going on. So this is what Perry looked like when he went to Japan. He was 58 years old, and he was given the command of the East India Squadron expedition to Japan. Before he went to New Bedford and asked about a Japanese boy from the Sandwich Islands. That was Manjiro, who became Manjiro Nakahama. And the reason he wanted to talk to him is because Manjiro was the first Japanese to live in the United States. He lived here for 10 years. He knew a lot about the United States. He learned the language. He learned a lot about navigation and many other things. Unfortunately, he had gone back to Japan because he was getting homesick, even though he was grew up here in Massachusetts, in New Haven, in Fairhaven. He wanted to go back. So Perry missed him, but he went to New Bedford to learn more about him and also to talk to the commanding officers of some of the whale ships. He wanted to know as much about Japan as he could possibly learn, and he did it all within 1 year before he went to Japan. So that's what he looked like before he went. This is another picture of what he looked like and also what the Japanese thought he looked like. They got the eyes pretty well, I think. The mustache and the beard is practically in all the Japanese images that you see of Commodore Perry show him with a beard and mustache and often with red hair. And that connection is because The Japanese at that time thought a lot of outsiders, Westerners, Americans, Europeans, were barbarians. And they had that red Viking hair, and a lot of people didn't see Perry because he was very seclusive. So they're drawing what they thought he looked like. But they got the eyes right, and they got the hair right. He did have quite a bit of hair, and I'll talk more about that. He was called Old Bruin by most Americans and most people on the ship because he was tough as a bear. He was hard going. He was rough on his people, but he demanded discipline. The Japanese looked at him as sort of a mysterious person because he kept himself aloof and in his cabin. Part of that was because he had a bad case of arthritis, but he also knew it as a good technique for diplomacy in regards to dealing with the Japanese. So this is what one of the sailors said about him. If you walked a straight line, you'd be okay with him. But Lord help you if you got off that line. And that was sort of the way people looked at Perry. As long as you're doing your job, you'd be okay. But don't make a mistake. And at that time, they had done away with flogging. And Perry thought flogging was good. He didn't want to give that up. He thought they should give away the grog. But the Navy did just the opposite. They did away with flogging, but they kept the grog. So where Perry learned a lot about diplomacy was also on his trip on the North Carolina to the Mediterranean. He spent a lot of time over there fighting Barbary pirates during his early years. And he was also involved on the Concord. This is his first command, the USS Concord in the 1930s. And this is where he ran into John Randolph's mission to Russia. And Randolph was a very cantankerous person that caused Perry a lot of trouble. At that time, Navy ships were ordered to take diplomats around and transport them to various countries. Perry was totally against it because he wanted to be command of his ship. And Randolph took command of his ship, got him to Russia, told Perry to wait 2 weeks because he wasn't sure he was going to like it there. So emptied all his stuff off in Russia, and then he said, I'm not going to stay in Russia, and they took him to England. Perry was furious. But even after that, then he had to deal with Lady Jane Franklin. This is the wife of John Franklin, famous for the Northwest Passage. She was very well known, and she got private transport on an American ship in the Mediterranean. So after this experience, Perry was totally against the Navy doing any transport of people, and the Navy did away with that technique. So now you don't get personal transport on a Navy ship. During the 1930s to the 40s, he had a long period of shore duty, and this is the house he was in the Brooklyn shipyard, and this is when he became a Commodore, because a Commodore at that time was the highest rank. We hadn't had Admiral yet. You became a Commodore if you had 2 commands. So he was command of the Navy shipyard at Brooklyn, but he was also commanding officer of all the ships there. So he had a dual role, which made him a Commodore. He started what was called a Lyceum in New York, in Brooklyn, and that was encouraging all the ships that were going overseas to bring material back. He was very curious of what other foreign countries had, and also the books. So that they started this Lyceum, was like a library with artifacts that eventually was transferred to the Naval Academy in Annapolis and also to the Brooklyn Library. During his time at sea, at the shipyard, he was very interested in steam power, knew about Fulton's work with steamers that were going up and down the Mississippi, and he was convinced the Navy should be converting to steam power. The old salts didn't want that. They were very much opposed to it. Perry had to fight him on that, and he became known as the father of the steam Navy. And he also worked a lot with lighthouses. He was the one that as a lieutenant, he put the flag in the ground on Key West. So if you go to Key West, thank Lieutenant Perry for claiming Key West, because we had bought Florida, but Key West wasn't part of the deal. And Cuba thought they owned Key West, so it's lucky that Perry went down and put the flag in, and now we have Key West. So, but it was during that period we got really interested in lighthouses because so many ships were going aground down there. It was a major scandal because they were actually forcing ships to go aground so they could wreck them and go in and take all their cargo. And then I already mentioned the flogging and the grog. He was a big socialite. He liked grog, he liked drinking. and I'm going to take a drink. But he also thought discipline was very important and that the flogging should remain. Went across the Atlantic on the Mississippi and stopped at Madeira, where he got a lot of wine. Unfortunately, this program was put into Zoom, and so I'm missing a lot of the narration and the other things I wanted. But anyhow, this shows the route he took across the Atlantic. At that time, all whalers were going around South America to get to the Pacific, but he went across the Atlantic to, his first stop was Madeira, where he got the wine, and then went around Africa and India and into the Asian area, Japan, and stopped at China, and then went to Okinawa, Naha, and then also to the Bonin Islands. And that's another whole interesting aspect of his ship, of his mission, of going there before he went to, hello. I don't know what happened here. I hope that doesn't last. So that last slide was a picture of the Shuri Temple in Okinawa, where he went, and that's where he had sort of a dress rehearsal. And the Japanese, Okinawa was so far from Tokyo that they were more independent, like they are today. They still have a lot of that independence, but he thought that was a good place to have a dress rehearsal. And so he went into Okinawa. Japanese didn't want him to go to the Shuri Temple because it was such a important area for the Japanese. He forced his way in there, and he was demonstrating what he could do with the force that he thought was important for diplomacy. That picture on the Mississippi shows the steamship heading for Edo Bay, Tokyo Bay, and when they first got there, they did soundings. You can see the man in the front, the bow of the boat, throwing out a lead weight. Perry was very interested in navigation and how close they could get to shore, because he wanted his ships to be as close to shore in case there were any problems with the Japanese. He had the dominant force of power. And also you see a man in the stern with a, probably hard to see, but he's using a sighting thing to get the good bearings of where they were located. Then when they arrived, the Japanese official came up, told them to go away. One of them said, "I can speak Dutch," which was an important point because the language was a major problem at that time. Perry had one person on board that could speak Dutch, and so they went from English to Dutch, and then the Dutch could speak to the Japanese or Japanese, but there were three languages back and forth that were constantly being necessary for all negotiations. And I'll mention one small aspect of a problem they had later on because of this translation problem that they were constantly dealing with. But the main thing is he wanted to come ashore and deliver the letter from President Fillmore. So he landed in July 14th, 1853 in Kuriyama, and in doing things in a big way, he came in to the temple on July 14th and delivered the letter, which was addressed to my great and good friend. At that time, Americans didn't know who was running Japan. We knew about an emperor, but we weren't so sure about the shogun. And the shogun was actually in Tokyo. The emperor was in Kyoto. So the shogun had, Tokugawa-era people had much more influence at that time in Japan than the emperor did. And of course, that changed later. But after he had I want to just talk briefly about this book that I read at the recommendation of my good friend Grant. This gives a background on the whole idea of gifting, the archaic aspect of it, how important it was in older cultures. And I think one of the things that's about this that I find interesting is how it's almost like an endogenous mechanism that we have within us, an innate behavior that we gift, and we know about that, we know about it subconsciously, and it's passed on. The other thing that's important I just want to mention is this book by the Smithsonian has some of the best records of what was given by the Japanese to us and what we gave to the Japanese. And it gets confusing because Perry and his men bought a lot of material. They brought tons of stuff back, literally tons of material. So sometimes one thinks that it was a gift from the emperor or a gift from the shogun, but sometimes it was purchased by them, because the United States and Perry was very interested in bringing back as much material as they could possibly bring back. I mentioned the gifts of the purchase of Madeira. Madeira was one of the big gifts that Perry used throughout the trip, and drinking alcohol was a major part of the diplomacy that Perry used. After he gave the letter and they asked, he said, I'm going to leave, I'm going to go away for the winter. They wanted to know if he was going to come. He said, I'm coming back. He says, will you come back with so many ships? 4 ships he had there originally. He says, I'll come back with more. And he came back with 8 ships. But the man named Kayama was the one that was, Kayama, who was very close to him. He was a police officer. They were saying he was a commissioner, but he wasn't a commissioner. He was a police officer, but he became very friendly with Perry. And so that when they left, this was the first gifting that was done with Japan and Commodore, Japan and the United States. Perry gave them sugar, wine, calico, and books. Wine probably being the biggest thing. Kayama hid it because at that time he wasn't supposed to take any gifts. So he hid it in his kimono. When he got into the boat to go back to shore, he broke the bottle of wine and he drank the wine before he got to shore, the Madeira bottle. And then he was reprimanded by the people on shore for taking gifts from the Americans. So there was this sort of anti-gifting that was going on by both the Japanese and the Perry. Perry did not want to take anything for free. He refused gifts at first because that was part of his ploy, not to accept, because when you accept a gift, going back to the book on gifting, that means you have to reply. And he didn't want to do that. So the whole idea of giving a gift is getting a gift in return. There was a lot of porcelain at that time that the Japanese had, and they had created a much superior porcelain that they had originally started from China, but the Japanese had done a better job on that. I don't know. So this is a slide of him landing in Japan, and the second time when he came back, and this is meeting up with the commissioners in Yokohama. One of the gifts that he gave the Japanese early on was a howitzer and also rifles. This was a big part of the idea of showing us the mechanisms that we had, the advances that we had in technology that the Japanese did not have at that time. They were extremely interested in the guns that we had on the ship. Perry allowed them to walk all over the ship, take notes. There was several people that the Japanese thought they were spies. Perry knew they weren't spies. He knew, he wanted them to take as many drawings that they could possibly take on the ship. And they were very interested in the big power that we had, the big cannons on top of the ship, but also in the rifles. And at that time, we had flintlock pistols and more sophisticated rifles than the Japanese had, which were left over from the era of the Portuguese. Portuguese introduced guns to Japan, but then they did away with them when they started the samurai period, and they thought the sword was more manly as a weapon. These are some of the main gifts that Perry delivered on March 13, 1854. The steam engine, this is a 1/4 size locomotive built in Philadelphia, built by the Norris Company. And then that was an important thing. And then they also had the telegraph line. Here's another image of, his is the railroad, the small railroad, and you can see a commissioner riding on the back of the passenger car. It went around a track, and the Japanese were very thrilled with this whole operation of the train, and the first time they had seen locomotion from steam. Now, it's important to realize that even though they were the Japanese, we could say they didn't know about this, the commissioners and a lot of the higher up people knew about this. It's the people of Japan and they didn't know about it, and that's why a lot of the power that Perry was trying to show, like with the locomotive and with the steam engines on the ships, was so new to the Japanese. There's another image, and The rating on the left shows February 54, that's the lunar calendar, it was actually March of 54. And then the Japanese talking about how it circulated around a track. And Perry had brought all this over there. I tried to track this train down, but it was lost in a fire in Japan in the 1800s, so there's nothing left of the train. This is the telegraph, which was another important gift because the Japanese did not know about the telegraph at that time. Even though there was a lot of telegraph information going on from the early 1800s, it hadn't passed down to Japanese because they were such a closed society at that time. And this is one image that was done it's at the Yokohama Archives. Here's another image that was from Brown University. It shows a man in the middle there starting to run. And they actually tried to have people outrun the telegraph, which is very similar to what we happened in this country with the indigenous people in this country trying to outrun the telegraph. And it was almost mysterious to some of these uneducated people. I think the commissioners and the higher-ups knew about the telegraph, but a lot of the people didn't. And you see one man in the right-hand side, he's covering up his face because it was almost like too scary to him. Some of them looked at the wire and they thought there was a hole in the wire to transport a message actually in the wire. And so there was a lot of this mysterious material aspects of the telegraph. I was really interested in the telegraph, so when in 1914 I was in Japan and I went to the Postal Museum there, and I was looking all around for it and couldn't find the telegraph, and I thought, well, that's strange, I knew it was there. But then I asked the docent where the telegraph was, and she said, oh, that's in back, we have that in the archives, it's not open to the public. Fortunately, my translator and guide whispered to her that I was related to Commodore Perry. Ooh, okay. She got sort of excited, and she says, if you give me 20 minutes, I'll show it to you. So I said, yeah, sure. So she ran back, took it out of storage, and set it up for me, because it was all back in storage. It wasn't like that. But it was a beautiful instrument. They had two of them there, actually, for the reception and for the transmission of the telegraph. The other thing that Perry gave them was clocks. And this is a clock that had been used a bit, but this was one of the original clocks. At that time, when Perry went there, the Japanese were on the lunar system, lunar time, where the Americans were on solar time. So it was very confusing. It was a more archaic system, and they transferred to solar time in 1872. Perry, when he went to Japan, had a pocket watch like this one that he had inherited from his brother, Oliver Hazard Perry. It was built and made in 1802 in Liverpool, England, by the Douglas Company. I have this watch. If anybody wants to take a look at it later, I'm happy to show it to you. It's been in the family since the early 1800s and passed down to me from my father. But it's got on the back of it, it says Oliver Hazard Perry, Battle of Lake Erie, and then Commodore Matthew Perry on the Mississippi in Japan. So that was one thing that Perry showed them. I only found that in one book where he actually took out the watch. It wasn't a gift, but it was an important aspect. Wristwatches hadn't come out until the early 1900s, so the pocket watch was the main thing. And at that time, it was mainly for navigation and for locomotion on the trains. Every train person had to have a watch to be on time. This is sort of a humorous print that was in a Japanese book. It showed a young man 17 years after Perry was there, and he was flaunting the Western ideas. So he's showing a pocket watch in his hand. Behind him is a fancy umbrella. Japanese had umbrellas, but Perry brought umbrellas that were apparently better than the Japanese umbrellas. And the Japanese also gave us umbrellas. So at the Smithsonian, there's umbrellas that they gave us and we gave them. And also he's showing that he's eating beef. He's got the little hibachi pot there where he's eating beef. And at that time, a lot of little shops were showing up in Japan that were interested in eating beef because it was not a common thing before Perry went to Japan. In the museum in Tokyo, you can see the scientific balances that Perry gave them, and also this supposed to be Dolan's telescope. Perry could use the telescope and see that the forts that the Japanese had set up on the land were not really forts. They were canvas. They weren't concrete or anything that's substantial. They were what Perry called dungaree forts, because they were made of cloth material, and the armament they had there was old, going back to the Portuguese time. So the Japanese hadn't kept up any armament, which put them at a great disadvantage, because Perry had showed them how much he had, and it was a much more powerful part that he had. The other aspect of giving, that was the first aspect, was mainly to dealing with the power and the technology. But Perry was also interested in showing them that we were not barbarians. We were educated. And so he brought a lot of technical material in the form of books. I divided it into 3 different areas. Perry was very interested in natural history, which is my expertise. He was interested in birds, mammals, but especially shell collection. He had a big shell collection. But then the second category was all about government and how laws were created, how we had in our government. And then the other thing was the technical aspects, the engineering, the lighthouses, and other aspects that he wanted the Japanese to know about. And there's an interesting story of what Perry did on one of his discussions with the Japanese. He had a book in his pocket, and he kept taking it out, and he would handle it a bit. And he'd look at it and handle it, and then he'd put it back in his pocket. And the Japanese didn't know what he was doing. He took it out again, and it was almost like he wanted to talk about it, but he didn't want to talk about it. He put it back in his pocket. And he did it the 3rd time. And he finally said, well, I know you don't want to start trade with the United States right now, but this is, in Chinese, the trade agreement that we worked out with China. So just consider it. And you know, Perry wasn't able to get trade started, but 2 years later, Townsend Harris did establish the trade with Japan with the Amity and Commerce treaty that was signed. Because I was interested in birds, I tried to track down the Audubon prints that were given to Japan. These prints now, recently there was one sold for $13 million. They're extremely valuable. I found out that there was one at the Misai University. I went there with a translator and talked to the curator that was there and had a view of this beautiful Audubon prints. They're very valuable. Unfortunately, it wasn't the one that Perry gave to Japan. And nobody knows what happened to those volumes of that birds and also the mammals that were given to Japan. They might have gotten lost over the years. They were given to the emperor, but all the things that Perry gave in Japan, in Yokohama, went to Tokyo. They didn't go to Kyoto. They went to Tokyo. And so whether they ever got to the emperor, it's unknown. But historians have recorded that it's probably they were either lost or not appreciated. Or the other possibility, during World War II, there might have been a lot of anti-American sentiment, just like we might have during a war period, and so that a lot of that stuff might have been done away with. But anyhow, one of the interesting things is this prince came from a very wealthy Japanese man who bought it for over $1 million and then donated it to the university. What he didn't realize was all Audubon prints were life-size. So when you're dealing with the turkey, the wild turkey, or the pelican, or the cranes, Audubon had them all in funny shapes. He had it down so the long neck would be down this way. The man didn't realize that, and he had a lot of the edges were sort of dog-eared. So he had somebody cut off a ½ inch all the way around. And it turns out, so some of the birds are scalped, the missing part of their head, because it was a full page. It was called the elephant paintings because it was a large print format. So this is one of the big dinners that Perry had. He was giving them soup, fish, beef, fowl, pickles, pies, fruit, and then he told one of his men, one of his officers, encourage the guests to eat and drink as much as possible. And then during the episode, when they got really feeling good after drinking Kentucky bourbon and Madeira wine and a lot of the other liquors that Perry had bought, one of the commissioners stood up and said, Japan and America, all the same heart. And Perry whispered to one of his men, if they just sign the treaty, he may kiss me. Because he was so determined that he was going to get that treaty signed. So what did the treaty say? Well, it was signed on March 31st, 1854. It established peace and friendship between the United States and Japan. That was one of the main things that Perry was after. Opening up 2 ports, Shimoda and Hakodate. Perry had already agreed to opening up 1 port, but when he got back to the ship and his men explained to him the translation, he said, no, that's not acceptable. And he reneged on the contract he had just signed. They went back, and he says, I want 4 ports opened up. And this was sort of the negotiation, part of the setting the deal. And he went higher than he really wanted, and the Japanese agreed having 2 ports, so they established Shimoda and Hakodate. Assistance with wrecked ships, because he wanted the whalers and other people that went ashore to have been given respect, not to be put in jails, or to denounce Christianity, which was a big thing at that time, but he wanted them taken care of. And then they wanted Japan to supply supplies for them in the form of cold water and other provisions, and he wanted to pay for it. He insisted on paying for it. What the Japanese did with other ships is they said, here, take water, take food, now leave. And that was part of the gifting idea. You don't accept something like that because you might have to, there's a downside of doing that. So what the Japanese got was that no major port was given. Shimoda and Hakodate were a good distance from Edo at that time because you had the mountains and the water that was in between those 2 ports. They had shielded the shogun and the emperor. Perry never got to see either one of them or deal with them, although he didn't insist on dealing with them. He wanted to deal with somebody at his level, and he always stayed back until he could get somebody at his level. He knew somebody at the emperor or the shogun level would be dealing with our president level, but he wanted to deal with somebody at his level. They prevented him from going to Tokyo, although he threatened many times of going to Tokyo. And they stopped him, and one of the translators said he'd have to commit suicide. Perry said that wasn't worth it. He didn't want this poor translator to commit suicide if he went further up. But he faked it several times. He pulled his anchor and acted like he was going to Tokyo. Maintained peace. Nobody was killed, and there was no fighting that went on during the mission. And I mentioned earlier the problem with translation. One of the problems was that an American consul would be unlikely due to a different text because of the translation. What the Japanese thought was that both countries had to agree to establish an ambassador there, to have a consul. What the United States thought that either one, if Japan wanted to come here, they could come here. If we wanted to go to Japan, we could send somebody there. So we sent Townsend Harris. Japanese said, no, we don't want Townsend Harris, and they resisted. And so Townsend Harris had a real rough time for the early years when he was in Japan, but he was eventually able to establish the treaty with Japan. And then after the treaty was signed, the Japanese gave entertainment. Perry had given entertainment in the form of minstrels and other shows that he put on the ship. This was done for Perry's entertainment. He wasn't totally impressed with the sumo wrestlers, and also with the food. This is sort of a funny picture of him. They provided the chairs for him and a feast, and he had many foods that were given that were part of the Japanese culture. His comment was, when they asked him about the food, he says, well, it'll never beat mutton and potatoes. Because that was his English and his New England heritage, having mutton and potatoes. But he had a lot of fish, and his junior officers and his men had a lot of fish also. This is a scene showing the officers sort of ruling over this, eating raw fish, which was such a big thing for them. And they also provided him a lot of other seafood with a lot of sake. So sake was in great supply at that time. Perry received gifts in the form of dogs, which was one of the big gifts that Japan was given at that time. And the dogs were called, at that time, they Japanese, I'm not sure what the Japanese name was, but Perry recognized them as King Charles Spaniels. And he thought immediately, that's where the King Charles Spaniel came from. It came from Japan, and sure enough, the Japanese had given it to the King of Japan, King of England, in the 1600s, a ship that had gone back to England. So the Japanese had developed the original strain of the King's Charles Spaniel, which is so common, and now it's a big dog in Japan as well as around the world. Interesting side story here. Perry died in 1858. In 1860, Conrad Maru came to San Francisco. Samurai came all the way around through the Panama, not canal, but on the train, came up the East Coast, stopped in Washington, Philadelphia, New York. When the samurai were in New York City, 2 of them went to visit Jane Perry, Commodore Perry's widow. When they walked in the house, 2 dogs were there, and the dogs went crazy. And both the family, the Perry family, and the Japanese samurai and the attendants said that they recognized the scent of the kimonos. And it's incredible. This is documented in several journals and book reports, that the actual scent of these dogs that had come from Japan and now were with Commodore Perry's widow in Brooklyn. And anyhow, the dogs were a big gift. The other gift was 200 bales of rice weighing 125 pounds apiece. One sumo wrestler carried 2 of them, another did somersaults while carrying one, and one grabbed a whole bale with his teeth. The person on the right is an American sailor who's having trouble lifting just one. The matchlock gun is what the Japanese had at that time. That was given to us as a gift, even though it was way behind what we had. At that time, a matchlock was a lit fuse that was on the gun at all times. So when you loaded it with powder, it was very dangerous. It could explode. But then you had to touch off the fuse for it to ignite. There was also the silver bowl, which the Tokugawa press, the 3 hollyhock leaves, and also these porcelain bowls. Porcelain bowls were a big gift from the Japanese that were given to Commodore Perry for the United States. A lot of it is in this Smithsonian at this time. This one, both these items that I have on this screen belong to a cousin of mine in California. Both of them are for sale right now. She just sold one of these bowls on the right, the blue and white bowl, for $9,000. So if you're interested in a bowl, I can tell you where to go. Perry went to Shimoda. After that was one of the ports that was open to him, and he was impressed with the cleanliness. One of the things he wasn't impressed with was the bathing with 2 genders, and he thought that was not proper. And when the manuscripts were written from the narrative from the expedition, they first printed the scene with the Shimoda in the bathhouse in Shimoda, and then Congress found out about it and they stopped the press and they took that picture out. So if you have the narrative that has the original nude scene in there, it's worth a lot more than the ones that don't have it. But this is also where he went and buried some of his men that had died on the mission. Shimoda gave us a block for the Washington Monument, which was being built at that time. Also, he went to Hakodate, which was open to the Americans at that time, and Hakodate gave a block for the Washington Monument. It was for the only king that they knew in the United States. So that's it. The other thing they gave, this is in Okinawa. They gave us a block of granite in Okinawa for the Washington Monument. They also gave us this big antique gong. And that gong they wanted in the Washington Monument because it's huge. It's about 6 feet tall. They wanted it in the Washington Monument. The officials in Washington said no way, so it went to the Naval Academy. It's where it is now. But actually the original one, Japan wanted it back. So we sent it back to them, and then they gave us a replica of it because it had a lot of historic significance to the Japanese. But that's at the Naval Academy if you ever want to take a look at that. This is the medal that Perry gave. He never got a Congressional Medal of Honor like his brother Oliver did, which he was sort of disappointed with. Perry had a big ego, and he thought he should have gotten a Congressional Medal of Honor. Some were given out last night, but he never got one. But he did get the medal from the merchants of Boston. They were so excited about starting trade with Japan, so they gave him this medal, and it was based on his profile that they have there. This is a daguerreotype of Perry that I showed earlier. He died March 4th, 1858, 64 years old. He was buried in New York City originally, but then his body was transferred to Newport at the Belmont Circle, and this is a monument to Commodore Perry and also to his wife, Jane. One of the interesting things that took place in 1928 was the granddaughters, 3 granddaughters of Commodore Perry, gave gifts to Japan. And the gifts included his wedding ring and locks of hair. And the brooch on the right is hair from Jane and from Matthew that was braided together. At that time, women would have hair from their husband when they went to sea. He went to sea for 3 years. You might not see him again, especially the whalers. So you had this hair from him originally. And they think that when he came back, they're not sure if this was done before he left, braiding the hair together, or if it happened after. But the interesting thing was, the granddaughters gave these personal gifts to the museum in Japan. So recently they had their 100th anniversary. It was not recently now, it's probably 6 or 8 years ago. They had the 100th anniversary of the museum in Japan, and I was in part of that, and I did a Zoom, and the Japanese wanted to know, why did the granddaughters of Commodore Perry give that to Japan? And I said, my immediate reaction was because the Perry family loved the Japanese, and it was a good place to go, probably better than the Naval Academy or the Navy War, the war in Newport, but to go to Japan. So that's where it is. I went to see it. Unfortunately, even though I had all the documents lined up to view the wedding ring and all, when I got there, the curator said I wasn't a historian. I'm a biologist, and he wouldn't let me see it. So that was sort of disappointing to me. But this is in Japan. It's considered a national treasure, and it's under lock and key, and it's not viewed by the public. One of the things that I was involved with when I was a kid was the 100th anniversary of Commodore Perry's trip to Japan. This is when I met the Consul General from New York. Boston Consul General hadn't been established yet, so the Consul General from New York came with his 14-year-old son. So he was about my age. It was sort of interesting that we met there, and I helped the Consul General put the wreath on Commodore Perry's grave. And then also, we put a wreath on the monument of Perry at Turo Park in Newport. This is the largest statue of Commodore Perry in the world. And then the Tiffany family, I mentioned the Tiffany, they donated a silver platter which I gave to the ship, the USS Perry, which was named for both Commodores. And I presented the captain of the ship, Commander Archie, this silver platter that the Tiffany family had donated. So those are a couple of things I was proud to take part in. And then we also sent this profile of the monument of Perry to Japan. This bust was sent over there, and I helped unveil that. And then the Japanese viewed it when it arrived in Japan, and then when I went on Japan on a trip, I tried to track it down, and finally tracked it down in a park in Japan with 2 historian friends of mine who have both written books on Commodore Perry and fairly well known for their work on Perry. I'm going to end up with telling a short story about this other statue of Commodore Perry that's in Perry Park in Hokkaido, Hakodate in Hokkaido. I was there in 2014. It was dedicated in 2004. I went with the man on the right, who's a professor at Sapporo University. We were both giving lectures. The man on the left with the white jacket on was the one who plays the part of Commodore Perry. But he insisted that I put on Commodore Perry's uniform, which I thought was sort of crazy. My wife thought I was stupid. But I put on the uniform, and it made the press. It was a big deal over there. But one thing I didn't notice at first was the jacket was missing a button. And I didn't notice it, so they pointed it out to me. And he said, "Did you notice there's a button missing?" And I said, "No, I didn't notice it." And he said, "Well, when they created this statue, the woman who created it, the sculptor, had done research on Perry, and she found out that when he went ashore in Hakodate, he had a loose button on his uniform. Japanese didn't know what buttons were at that time because they were using cords and obies to hold themselves together, so buttons were a big deal. The button that he had on his uniform was loose, and somebody pointed it out to him. He ripped it off and handed it to the person. That generosity from Commodore Perry was considered such a big deal that the woman who created the statue left the button out, and also the man that played the role didn't have it in the uniform. So if you look closely on the uniform, it's missing a button. And just a final little trivia, if you ever look at a picture of Commodore Perry that Matthew Brady did after he came back from Japan, it's missing a button. But nobody knows if the button was just not done or if it was actually missing. And so I'll leave that as my final comments, is showing the generosity and the friendship, the gifting, the role it played over the years, and how important it was to create the friendship between our two nations that continues to this day. Happy to answer any questions if we have time.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that Professor Grimes may make a comment or two, and we'll open it to questions to people after that.
So I'm going to be pretty quick because I'm not sure that I'm needed. But since I'm standing here and my name was on the program, I feel like I should say something. The reason I accepted this is because I always say yes to Grant. But I do know that I'm probably not the best person. I think Grant would be better at this. And I think that Eric Goldstein is the only person I know in the world who is an actual expert on state visits, and therefore on gift giving and the symbolism of these sorts of exchanges, is sitting as far away from this podium as he possibly can. And I can't explain exactly why, but probably, Eric, you should be doing the job. But since neither one of them is, I will attempt to do a little bit of the job myself. So, as a political scientist, I'm not a historian. I look at history as largely happening as a series of large forces interacting with each other. And the large forces that interacted with each other in 1853 were this rising power of the United States with amazing technological backing and also a large and prosperous population and economy that was becoming a Pacific power. And it was running into this other place called Japan, which was also a very well-developed civilization with high levels of technology of certain sorts, but that had chosen for the last 350 years to close itself, 250 years, to close itself off from rivals as a way of maintaining domestic order. And in those 250 years, Japan, of course, had progressed in a variety of ways, but the West, Europe and the United States, had progressed more. Not in terms of culture. I mean, come on, we all know that American culture is, whatever it is. But rather in terms of economic prowess, technology, and the growth of citizen democracy of a sort that you didn't really see in Japan. And so these two things, these two forces, this is the story that we tell ourselves as political scientists, is these two forces meet, and the sort of overwhelming force of the United States essentially makes itself evident to Japan, and Japan has to accept. Okay? And Japan opens up against its will initially. You end up with changes of government within Japan. There are rival factions, of course, within Japan because Japanese are human beings, and eventually you get the adoption of a series of practices from the United States and Europe, as well as indigenous ideas and actions, and you get the first rapid growth economy. And by 1904, 1905, which is the point at which Consul General Takahashi and Grant Road first made their appearance in this talk, Japan is able to defeat a European power in war, decisively in the Russo-Japanese War. And so the period from 1853 to 1904 is this period of rapid change in Japan, of taking this forced opening, and taking advantage of it to then become sort of the master of its own domain. And in the meantime, other things are happening in this period. Japan becomes the most powerful country in East Asia, and not by a small amount. It defeats China in a war, taking Taiwan, taking treaty spaces within China proper. It takes Korea as a colony. And eventually we have the whole 20th century happens, which I'm not going to get into. So that's the political scientist version of it, which is forces running into each other, technology, economy, military, and choices that are made about whether to go to war or not to go to war. But there's other ways of looking at this, right? So we've been treated to a family history. And it's worth noting that all historical events have family histories. I mean, not all of us are descendants of Matthew Perry, right? But all of us are descendants of people who were affected by these large historical encounters. And so there are histories, there are personal histories of these periods in which you get particular perspectives on the events that happened that feel different from the big story that I just told. And then another way of looking at it is through the lens of diplomacy. And diplomacy, again, in my story, the diplomacy ends up with you have a force that hits, and you have an outcome. And the outcome is Japan sort of accepts what it has to do in order to not have to go to war with a power that it's not going to win, and then it takes advantage of the opportunities that are made over time. But that diplomatic point is extremely important. Like that was not the necessary diplomatic outcome of these visits by Matthew Perry. And as an important part of the diplomacy, gift giving. Okay, this is how we're going to come back to gift giving. Okay, I'm not very good at gift giving myself, but my wife is much better at it. So we always give things as a couple, because then I look very thoughtful. I can write a nice card and sort of justify why we care so much as to give you this wonderful gift that I didn't think of. But gift giving has, in diplomacy, has rules. It is a means of communication, and it's a means it's a symbolic means of demonstrating a whole variety of things. And I think that Dr. Perry's talk addresses many of these things. One, of course, is you want to bring in the gift that shows that you're really, really rich, that you're very powerful. The reason why I don't know this story at all, let's be clear. I mean, I know the basic story, but I know one part of the story, which is that Matthew Perry gives a train and a telegraph, right? This is the thing that stays. And the reason it stays is because it's so revolutionary from the Japanese perspective. And it's such a symbol of the power of the United States that goes beyond the military power that's shown in the black ships, which are ships that can travel across vast oceans with guns that can that can knock down castle walls, and not just dungaree castle walls, but like actual castle walls down in Satsuma and Shoshin. So that's one of the things that is communicated in here. At the same time, right, there's an attempt to communicate we're civilized, right? That there's more to this American thing than just the ability to move projectiles and electrons vast distances at very fast speeds. And so you get the cultural things. And of course the Japanese are doing the same. They're trying to show, don't mess with us. And well, they didn't have the cannons that the Americans have. But they do have the samurai. And they do have sumo wrestlers. And the sumo wrestlers are pretty impressive, right? And they're bringing their big bales of rice. And I don't know how many of you ever have seen sumo up close. It's awesome. It's awesome. And these guys are so big, right? And even though they kind of look, not like Mr. Olympus type of fitness, they are extremely flexible and strong and able to like do the splits and things that I can't even imagine doing. So there's this effort to show again the Japanese level of civilization, of power, of intransigence, of like that don't mess with us sort of thing. And there's a couple other things that I think are worth thinking about in this gift giving, because okay, so when I lived in Japan, my mother was very involved in Japanese society, and one of the things that was the most complicated for her was to learn the gift-giving cultures. And Japan has extremely intricate rules about personal gift giving. Not just when you give it, but how you give it, what type of thing you give, when you, who you give it to, who gives things first. And of course, Perry knows nothing about this. It's completely not, it's not a personal gift giving thing. At the same time, there is another gift-giving tradition that the Japanese clearly knew about, that had its own set of rules and its own set of expectations and norms and symbolism. And that was the Chinese tributary system, of which Japan was not a part. Although Chinese always say that Japan was a tributary state. Japan was never actually a tributary state. But the Japanese were very aware of this. And the Chinese tributary system operated in a pretty specific hierarchical means, which is that you bring something you think that the emperor is going to like, and the emperor gives you something better. And you accept it, and you kowtow, and you bring it home. Right? And so one of the little conflicts behind gift giving at the diplomatic level, maybe not conflict, maybe games, is you always want to show you're stronger, better, and more generous. Right? You always want to give the better gift. So years ago, I gave up on this in Japan. Like, I know I'm never going to give the better gift, so I try to do something symbolic that, that isn't going to, that I'm not going to get embarrassed by. But for Perry, he's actually doing the same thing as Dr. Perry was pointing out. He's trying to establish a position, a hierarchically superior position, in which he's providing something to you that you can't have otherwise. And then, you're going to give me something, and it'll be nice, right? And that's part of the gamesmanship that's going on in here. But it's the final point I want to make is that it's not just gamesmanship. It's not just power and demonstration of capabilities and warfare by other means or something like that. All of which may be true at some level, but the particular again, tell me later if I'm wrong. The particular symbolism of gift giving is not just those things, but also that it's gift giving. That it's also an exchange. It's not compellence, right? It's not a threat. It's not charity. It's an exchange. And that, and even if there's, some sort of conflict underneath, it says we're holding off on the conflict for another day. We're going to try to manage this relationship and develop a relationship that is not adversarial and that has opportunities for cooperation. And of course, I'm going to finish because I said I would be brief, and I don't think I've been as brief as I anticipated. But you put a professor in front of a class, and we do this sort of thing. But it's actually a pretty good metaphor for what happens over the next, I don't know how many years. Like, I'm not sure where to put our end point of two countries that don't have identical interests, and in many cases have very different interests, right? But that for most of this period, even when they have the most profound differences, they're resolving them peacefully in some sort of exchange, not always without compellence, not always completely willingly, but always with this sort of this notion of exchange. And the sole exception is the worst exception, right? Is the period of the Second World War. And of course, you know, it's not like there were no problems before. It's not like there's been no problems since. But that practice of exchange and the importance of the gifts that we give each other, I think, has remained. And going back to Matthew Perry, it sounds like somebody's trying to break down the door. I don't know if that's getting recorded.
It's broken now.
Okay. So anyway, but that's everything I have to say. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that added food for thought. And so we'll open it to any comments about the presentations or questions. Okay, why don't we take one here and then over here? Go ahead.
Hi. Oh, should I speak to the front?
Yeah, you can just face everybody and
Okay.
tell us who you are.
All right. Thank you for that amazing presentation first. I really appreciate it. It definitely taught me a lot new things, aspect about gift giving. I have a few questions. Oh, my name is Mona, freshman studying political science at BU from Miss Yes class. And my question is, you emphasized a lot as like gift exchange as diplomacy, and that's our topic. How should we personally understand Perry's technological gifts alongside his military presence? And was that like a contradiction or more of a part of a coherent strategy of like signaling power?
Okay, why don't we ask one more question, we'll take the two.
Me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for this. You briefly mentioned the first stop, namely in the Kingdom of Ryukyu. So my question is, do we have sources for what happened in Naha? Was there also an exchange of gifts between the Ryukyuan authorities and Perry? Did he get to meet King Shotai, who was the last king of the kingdom? Is this information available in the sources somewhere?
Okay, so why don't we take these two questions, and maybe we'll take this question first.
Okay.
This is, so you're really asking about the, in terms of the gift exchange vis-a-vis the military, what was the relationship between that?
You're talking about the difference between them? I mean, he was using both the power and the gifts at the same time. I mean, the Japanese were so concerned about the armament that he had on the ship, the huge guns and all, and that was overwhelming to them at that time. And the gifts were, like we said, it was showing his power in the form of gifts. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question totally. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I think it's the two things. One is showing the depth of American power, but also, I don't think I said this, but it suggested the opportunities that would be available to Japan by opening itself up to trade. That you could, you know, Japan had things that were attractive for trade, a lot of things, and they could gain access to things like railroads. So it's partly an enticement, as well as, you know, that kind of implicit threat that you're talking about.
Yeah, the padded glove, I guess, had two sides to it. And the question about Okinawa and Shuri, the Ryukyus and the Shuri.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much he, at that time they had the Queen Dowager, they referred to her as, and the Japanese were constantly saying that you were going to disturb her, you know, and she was going to be upset because she was elderly. They were saying that it would be a threat to her health if he went to Shuri Castle. So that was a big aspect of it. But he never saw anybody really high up in Luchu, Ryukyus. So I don't think that was. He was using that more as a demonstration of how he was going to deal with the Japanese, whether he could force his way in, which he was able to do, and he did it in a big way. When he came ashore, He brought bands, he brought all his Marines. It was a show of force and a lot of armed men. They were all armed when they went ashore in Yokohama. I'm not sure about Okinawa because it was much friendlier reception there. But he didn't know what to expect in Yokohama or in Uraga, Kuriyama. So he had his ships as close to shore as possible. And there were 10,000 samurai. There were samurai under the table, under the area where they was eating, and they were ready to have conflict. Fortunately, they never had conflict, but there was people behind the scenes that were ready. And so Perry is essentially saying he's got 8 ships out there, or 4 ships on the first trip, saying these ships are all facing your shore. If anything happens to me or my men, the town's going to be obliterated. So that's that force that he was using to effectively, because the Japanese knew that they couldn't overcome that force. They had technologically they'd gotten behind because they hadn't kept up with the gun. There's a great book written on in Japanese about the gun called "Giving Up the Gun," and it's a beautiful book that shows how important it was for the Japanese to go to the sword and how more respectful the sword was than shooting somebody at a distance. And so I think that shows some of that conundrum that the Japanese were in, and Perry took advantage of it. So, and Perry didn't appreciate the gifts that Japan was giving him. Japan was very advanced in regards to culture and the arts, which doesn't really come out in a lot of the written parts of the Perry's expedition. But there's a book written called the Edo Inheritance, and it was written by Tokugawa. I met the man in San Francisco, Tokugawa, 25th generation of the Tokugawa regime, and he wrote this beautiful book, emphasizes how important that whole 250-year period was in regards to the arts, education, and all the great things Japan was doing. Perry thought the gifts were not that valuable. I mean, what are you going to do with 200 bales of rice, Eat it, and not something like giving a railroad or the telegraph or the daguerreotype. Look what they did with photography in Japan after getting that first daguerreotype and knowing about photography, advanced it a lot. He didn't appreciate that. And in fact, he said, if the government wants to sell all these gifts, they can do it. Fortunately, they did, and a lot of it is at the Smithsonian. But anyhow.
Okay, thanks. Professor Berger?
Well, thank you very much for the fascinating presentation. I guess I'll just offer an observation and a question. The observations, there were quite a few different, contacts between European powers in beginning the late 18th and through the 19th century and Asian counterparts. And the famous one is Lord Macartney visiting China in 1792. And there were also gifts given and received, and there was an exchange. But I think it was the Qianlong Emperor at that point. And then what was interesting in that particular case was that the Chinese emperor as famously said, "Thank you for your gifts, but we really don't need anything you have." And there was no negotiation which came out of it. With Japan, there were earlier efforts. I think that the Dutch were trying to reach out already in the 1840s to Japan, and Japan simply said no, 1844. And then you had Perry, and then 1 month later, I believe it was the Russian Admiral Putyatin who visited as well. In that case, again, you had exchanges. The Russians, by the way, also gave very similar gifts, including a locomotive, but interesting enough, it had to be Russia. Their locomotive was alcohol-powered, which somehow seems very appropriate. I hope it was vodka. But in any case, and in that case, you had similar kinds of treaties which were created, the Treaty of Shimoda in the Russian case, and they gave them 3 multiple ports. I think the big difference, of course, and this is what IR scholars would be emphasizing a lot, is that the Japanese, and this also had come to the conclusion that they had no choice but to open up. And what they just had to look was what had happened to China between 1839 and 1842. So there had already been a decision inside of Japan to make, or at least among some Japanese, to accept those gifts, however awkwardly given by the Westerners, to enter into it. what I'd like to, sort of the question which I can't remember, and I'm sure you know more about, was a little bit more on the Japanese side. I mean, this was a tremendously contentious issue inside of Japan, would lead to all kinds of internal turmoil. What was a little bit more on the sort of Japanese decision about receiving gifts from agreeing to receive gifts and moving forward?
Well, you got to realize one big thing about that, you mentioned the Chinese, is Japan is an old country, China is an old country, Europe's an old country. We were a new country. We had been a colony. And so one of the things he could do is convince the Japanese we weren't interested in Japan as a colony. Japan was concerned about Russia and China, or England and France coming in and taking over. And Russia was really eager to come into Japan, like you mentioned, Council General mentioned. The fact that that's why he went early. Perry wasn't going to go back until the spring. He left and arrived in February. He went 2 months early because he heard the Russians were coming down. So anyhow, I think you're right. They kept saying they don't need anything. Why are you giving us gifts? We don't need anything here. We'll give you gifts. Just go away. Leave us alone. But they eventually did realize, and there was so much turmoil going on at that time, the whole fighting, whether to restore the emperor or chase the barbarians out, that fight back and forth. Country was split, Sometimes countries get split in the middle. And so you're dealing with these two forces that are fighting each other. And eventually they had to realize that the samurai, the shogun, could not defend Japan. And so if the Russians had come down there, the Russians could have marched in, or the Brits could have marched in. And they knew about China, like you said, and the Opium Wars, and they didn't want that. So.
Yeah, that's a great parallel. Okay, Professor Mignet, while Eric's thinking over his comment or question.
Very quick one.
Yeah, well, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, well, this is fascinating. I had to go, but just from the first half and the ending, it's amazing. I have a very simple question. That is, do you think the gift giving as a diplomacy more effective or more likely in Asian context, or in particular East Asian context, or it's a global? So I'm thinking, will this still work in European or non-Asian contexts?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm not the expert on that. I read the book that on gifting, and it deals with archaic, old, historic countries, and I was hoping that book would lead up to examples like Japan or other countries and what they did. But I still do feel like gifting is part of our innate behavior that we want to give. And I always think about just giving a bottle of wine. You're going to somebody's house, you give them a bottle of wine, they give you a dinner. And so it's a nice exchange. It shows friendship and camaraderie, and you're together. But I don't know the technical aspects of it. Go ahead.
I think gift giving has been a part of European diplomacy since forever, right? And it probably is at least partly personalistic, going back to the eras of personalistic rule, and so but it's gotten institutionalized in diplomacy, and even if you're like, well, maybe current U.S. president accepted. When a U.S. president gets a gift, if it's over $1,000, he has to either pay tax on it, or to give it to the National Archives, right? So it's been the personalized aspect is theoretically removed. I think that we're seeing the return of personalistic rule in at least a few different countries, among the ones that we're talking about today, at least half of them. And it turns out that the Sultan likes good gifts.
Pride.
Another aspect of that is the fact Perry was well aware that anything that was given to him as an official government worker making $1,000 a year, he had to give to the government. And that's why he bought so much material of his own. And I've just recently received some beautiful porcelain that was given to me by one of my relatives, and she said the Emperor of Japan had given it to Commodore Perry. Well, I was pretty impressed, I was pretty excited, it's beautiful, We checked it out with a porcelain expert in Japan, and they say, no, he bought it in China. It's China porcelain. Beautiful, similar to some of the Japanese, but it wasn't a gift to Perry from the emperor. He bought it because he knew that anything that was given to him was not his. And he wanted to give things to his wife and his sister and all, which he did. But anyhow, that's part of that problem with government. And I experienced that as a government worker. I got reprimanded once for taking a lunch that was over $25. That was our limit, $25. If you had anything over than that, you were in trouble.
Any other student questions right now? And Maria, would you like to?
I'm not a student. I just recall in my graduate studies that there's this French sociologist, his name's Pierre Bourdieu, and he had this extensive study on gift giving, right? And one significant element of his theory, and if I remember it correctly, is the time delay, because the time delay in the supposedly in exchange kind of masks the social obligation that the gift giving creates, right? And he sees it actually as said already earlier, like a symbolic domination, symbolic violence. So I wonder in this particular case, if the time delay element was present, or because for him, immediate exchange of gifts does not create the social obligation, and because otherwise because gift giving is considered to be a calculated action. So yeah, I just want to know if that applies to.
One thing that I think you're getting to is Perry spent a whole year planning to give gifts. He knew gifts were important. He spent a lot of his own money, and I mentioned the fact that his son-in-law was a Belmont. The Belmonts had a huge amount of money, and he donated money to Perry to help buy gifts, because the government, Perry was constantly complaining about the government not funding him. When he took Randolph to Russia, Randolph had $10,000 in his disposal for gifts. Perry had zero. His salary was $1,000, Randolph's was $10,000. So it's a huge disparity in what he could do. And he's complaining to the government, give me more money because I have to buy gifts to give to the Japanese. I don't think the Japanese were ready to reciprocate. So that might be the time delay you're talking about. And I think even some of the gifts they were sending to Shimoda after he was already gone. And he's picking up more gifts in other areas. And also the other thing that was going on is, because he was so concerned about the technology and the culture of Japan, he was asking, he had a whole list of things he wanted to take back that he was willing to pay for, because he wanted the United States to know about Japan. And a lot of that is scattered. I've got a historian friend that's trying to find a 24-foot boat that the Japanese gave us. We don't know what happened to it. It's like disappeared. But it was the boats, he was very impressed with how fast they went. And it's amazing, because if you ever look at a Japanese print of Japanese rowing, they're facing forward. And you know the way we row is facing backwards and pulling, not pushing the oars. But the boats were designed to be extremely fast and sleek, and he was impressed with that and wanted to bring one back. But anyhow, some of those gifts were delayed, so I don't know if you want to respond to the delay point.
I'll make just one quick point, and it really relates more to Bill's comments about the forces that are at play. And that is that every year there are Black Ships festivals in Rhode Island, and they attract at a maximum of about 2,000 people. So it's a celebration of this event. There are a number of the population that know. In Japan, those celebrations are about 200,000 people. So why is that? What is that difference all about? And so really the importance of this mission of Perry going there, it really was a hinge moment in Japanese history that resulted in a move from the shogun to the emperor. That was something that from feudal society into modern society. So that, the impact of this event, although it's a family history and it's a naval history here in the United States, and it has a fairly limited audience, that the impact of this particular event and you may want to make a comment about this, and that the impact of that moment on Japanese history, which is just seems more profound.
Yeah, I always think about this, historical episode, and on the diplomatic front, this was a hard power thing, that may change, to a diplomatic course, the
Yes.
Soviet government. But internally, it's really created a sort of real beginning of the modernization process and the change in psychological, impact upon the young leaders, who led the major restoration, that is the modernization, reforms of Japan. So it's this gifts for us. For those Japanese, must have been really a sort of shock and awe, sort of items, on the diplomatic fronts. But it really creates sort of the atmosphere of the sincere respect and admiration, toward the Western civilizations, and which did generate the really, basically made our intellectual leaders psychologically and intellectually pass the sort of Rubicon things in terms of their policy course and policy making for the new era to come. So again, to me, this is a really interesting moment of the history, and I always feel this is a kind of destiny, of our friendship, between Japan and the U.S. We are sort of from the outlook, we are kind of forced to open the door to your country, but thanks to your technologies and other leading civilizations originated from the West, that really really brought the waves of the modernizations and sort of departure from the feudal system, which lasted for hundreds of years. So so lots of items and the fruitful thoughts out of this histories, and to me, as a diplomat, also very much interesting to see the what was indeed in the playbook, for the Commodore Perry's missions. There was 1 year interval between the two visits to Japan, and that was actually the second visit when they brought, and showed these most impressive, powerful cars to the Japanese side. And in between, they spent, in my understanding, the Hong Kong or those southern port areas of China, and what sort of discussions, or how they did actually strategize, the end game to finish this negotiation during the stay in southern China. That is, and the decision to bring these the decisive gifts to Japan. That process of internal debates among themselves, to me, sounds always very interesting. So thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, well, let me thank our presenters today, Dr. Matthew Perry and Consul General Takahashi and Professor Bill Grimes, and for a very interesting and insightful get-together. And we had scheduled through till 6 o'clock, so those of you who, if you may have a question, you can stay and talk, but I think we're ready to break at this point. So thank you all very much.